Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Conservatism, Classical Liberalism, and Public Life. I'm Andy Smarick, a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute. I'll be moderating today, and in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our three fantastic presenters. But first, I just wanted to begin briefly with some throat clearing, just get us all on the same page on why we decided to do this event. As I like to think about it, this conversation is a kind of counter-reformation. It's a response to a reform effort that's currently underway in parts of the conservative world. So today, we're having a discussion about shoring up or restoring some of the longstanding principles that have animated many of us on the right for quite some time. So what is this reformation effort to which this event is designed to be the counter? Well, that reformation effort is the idea that classical liberalism has failed us, that classical liberalism has produced and will continue to produce some of the most troubling features of contemporary American social and political life. More specifically, some believe that liberalism fetishizes individual autonomy, that it elevates personal freedom above all else. This then leads, it is argued, to feelings of alienation. So liberalism, it said, undermines community solidarity. It threatens traditional, including faith-based ways of life that ground us and give us meaning. It stops institutions from restraining behaviors that history tells us ought to be restrained. It inhibits government from pursuing a vision of the common good, and so on. So that's part of the current case being made against classical liberalism. Now, although I personally share some of these critics' worries about the state of social and political life, my view is that classical liberalism is not to blame. In fact, I think America has evolved an absolutely genius system that complements liberalism with self-government and a robust civil society, institutional design, civic virtue, and similar things. So my view all along has been that if we actually defend that collection, that combination of liberty, pluralism, democracy, federalism, localism, originalism, voluntary associations, that package of American governing social goods, if we defend that, that's the path to addressing many of the concerns that we share on the right. But others believe that classical liberalism has either gone too far or inevitably becomes corrosive. So they would say that liberalism is part of the problem or is the problem, whereas some of us actually say that liberalism is at least part of the solution. Now, I want to be clear that the community that's been critical of liberalism is not monolithic. Those raising objections to liberalism can have a wide array of different views on which liberties ought to be curtailed, how much power Uncle Sam should have, how much power states and locals should have, whether government power should be determined through democratic deliberation or through some kind of administrative unelected state, how much of the government's agenda ought to be derived from natural law or revelation or something else, how much variation in governing at the local level is allowed, and so on. The point of that is that our purpose here is not to try to object to any particular policy prescriptions, because I'm not quite sure that there's an anti-liberal policy agenda yet. Our job here is more along the lines, as I see it, as trying to appreciate the place that liberalism has played in American society and governing, particularly among those of us on the political right. Or said another way, we're going to try to understand what the costs of doing away with classical liberalism as one of the tall poles in the tent of American right-of-center governing. So we have three absolutely outstanding panelists joining us today, and each has thought a great deal and written convincingly about these issues. In fact, we are including links below to pieces that each of them have written about different corners, different aspects of this topic, and I highly recommend, encourage you to take a look at those. They are quite brilliant, thought-provoking. They've changed my thinking on a number of matters. And as you're soon going to learn, there are some interesting commonalities among what they have written and probably what they'll say. Maybe most interesting to me is that there's a difference between liberalism that you read in a book and liberalism as what I like to call freedom in action over time. That is, one of the first one is just a set of concepts, whereas the latter involves real people doing real public service, participating in real public life, creating and adapting real institutions and practices, and navigating real differences in beliefs and customs and visions of the good life. So our guests don't agree on everything, and I'm going to actually try to encourage or surface some of those differences to keep this lively. But each of them is going to get to say their piece, and we'll have at it from there. Okay, here's how we're going to proceed. Each panelist gets about 5 minutes or so to open up. I might ask a quick follow-up question or two just to provoke them or to clarify, but then we're going to turn this into a discussion. I like to get viewers' questions and comments into the mix as quickly as possible. So if any of you watching at home have a thought, a question, a complaint, any of the above, just use the chat feature to send us something, and I will do my level best to integrate that, get that into the bloodstream as soon as I can. All right, our guests in order of presentation. First up is Dan Burns. He is an associate professor of politics at the University of Dallas, where he is also currently serving as interim associate dean of the College of Liberal Arts. He's also a contributing editor of the great online journal, The Public Discourse. Next up will be Stephanie Slade. She's a managing editor of Reason magazine. In 2016, she was selected to the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship, and in 2013, she was a finalist for the Bastiat Prize for Journalism. Her work has appeared in U.S. News, the New York Times, the American Magazine, and much more. And last but certainly not least is James Patterson. He's an associate professor of politics at Ave Maria University. He's a research fellow at the First Liberty Institute and the author of Religion in the Public Square, Sheen King and Falwell. All right, I will hush up now. Dan, do you want to kick us off and tell us about this difference between liberal practice and liberal theory?
Thanks very much, Andy. And thank you to the Manhattan Institute for sponsoring this panel. I think it's a wonderful thing when a think tank can just push back a little bit on the pressure to be constantly saying something immediately relevant to the news cycle or to this month's policy debates, and can just sponsor a serious conversation about some of the deeper questions behind those debates. Not every think tank is willing to do that. MI obviously is, and I'm really grateful to Andy for getting us together to have this conversation. Andy started by referring to critics of liberalism, so I should begin by admitting that I'm one of them. In a sense, I'm a critic of what many people have called liberal theory, and I'm a defender instead of what I have called liberal practice. I may actually be the most anti-theoretical person on this panel, which is kind of funny because I'm a professional political theorist. Maybe that's why. Liberal theory is, I would say, a set of philosophical claims about how a country is supposed to run. And if I can be very frank here, I think a lot of the reason that thoughtful folks on the right side of the political spectrum are raising so many questions about liberal theory, and legitimate questions in my view in many cases, I think a lot of that reason is that some of my fellow political theorists have been overselling political theory, and particularly doing so to conservatives. I mean, if you read Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, which you should, I think it's the most thoughtful work by a conservative in the past decade or two, just laying out this case against liberal theory. I am pretty sure that I haven't asked him, but I'm pretty sure the most important enemy that Patrick has in his sights in this book is a certain sales pitch that conservative political theorists have been using to make the stuff that we do in the classroom sound really important. And I would crudely summarize that sales pitch as the following. There are great books in the Western tradition that explain the nature of politics. They're all on that shelf, right? John Locke's second treatise is perhaps the greatest of them. The founders of this country read those books and put their ideas into practice. And if we too read those books, then we can learn what makes this country great and continue to put the founders' ideas into practice, particularly by using those ideas to fight all of our progressive enemies who wish to throw those founding ideas out the window. So that's the sales pitch. Patrick Deneen and others respond to that sales pitch by essentially saying, it's true that the founders put into practice John Locke and maybe Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, some other early modern thinkers, but those thinkers were wrong. They're fundamentally mistaken about the nature of humanity and about the nature of politics. And so, by relying on those ideas, the founders wove into our American constitutional fabric this sort of magic destructive thread that was bound sooner or later to cause the whole thing to unravel, even if they didn't fully realize it at the time. So I share a lot of the criticism of those thinkers, but I have my main objection, I suppose, is the assertion that the founders of this country can best be summarized as having put those thinkers into practice. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I see the zoom out, which I understand means that I've reached the end of my 5 minutes. So let's pick it up later.
No, as a matter of fact, if you have more to say, please do, because I think this distinction between liberal practice and liberal theory is huge. As I like to think about it, people living in liberty don't just become atomized; they do a bunch of stuff. They create institutions and practices that actually lead to what we would call liberal practice. That's very different than liberal theory. So, if you want to expand on that, please do.
Okay, sure. Well, I think that the most important or distinctive claim about what I'm calling liberal theory is this assertion that the government needs to be neutral between competing claims of the good, this alleged neutrality. I think a decent number of young conservative-leaning folks are trained to understand their own political commitments through the lens of this idea of liberal neutrality. And I think at some point, a lot of people start to notice that it's not true, that no government is in practice neutral between competing claims of the good life, that every government effectively privileges some ways of life over others, whether it admits that or not, and that when people claim that the government has to stay neutral between competing claims of the good life, usually what they mean in practice is they don't want other people to impose views of the good life that they disagree with, but they still manage to find somehow ways for the government to support some of their own views of the good life. And that's true. You see it in education policy, you see it in family policy, you see it in matters of church-state relations. You even see it, I think, in economic policy, which ultimately depends on some vision of a healthy family life that we want our economy to be supporting. And so I would say, if you want me to conclude with this distinction, I like our liberal political system very much. I like our founders very much. I do think they read John Locke and other great thinkers of the Western tradition. I don't think they completely followed any of them in practice, because I don't think that's how the relationship between theory and practice ever works. And I think that nearly everything about our system of government can be defended without accepting either this idea of liberal neutrality or any other principle of liberal theory. And so I just think that our policy debates tend to run best when we talk instead about just concrete decisions and practices that can sustain the American way of life, or the range of American ways of life that we in the conservative political coalition can more or less agree are the range of ways of life that we want our government to be supporting, rather than trying to base our recommendations on sweeping philosophical theories, which I don't think works.
So if I can just do one more beat on this, one of the things I found most interesting in your essay that we're linking to from National Affairs is you actually do some sort of list of, here are the things that are in liberal practice and here are the things that are in liberal theories. And like, one might not even totally understand the other. So if you could read John Locke, you might never get the idea of enumerated powers, or of like our system of jury trials, or like a view of separation of powers, or federalism, or Tocqueville's idea of a widely active civil society. So those are the things that we live with and we think of liberal practice, right? But you're not going to get that from the liberal theory books. Do I have that right?
Yes, I do think that not only do I think it's not there, I think that efforts to follow these theories in practice, I mean, I don't think these theories can ever be fully followed in practice, because I don't think that it works that way. But I think that efforts to follow them more consistently in practice can often lead precisely to undermining these aspects of our nation's traditional practices that we value most highly. And federalism, as you mentioned, is one terrific example of that, and localism. I mean, there's no basis for that in these types of philosophical deductive theories of politics that I'm talking about. And so the more you try to live by those theories, the more you run the risk of end up crushing these things that are the reason that we like liberalism, and that drove people, I would say, to these theories, as when the claim was these theories will explain what you like about liberalism in practice. And my answer is they don't explain it. We have to look elsewhere for an explanation.
That's great. Slade, can I turn it over to you?
Sure thing. So this phenomenon that we're discussing today, I have sort of nicknamed the Great Liberalism Schism. And just to begin with, I think it is worth noting up front that it is not limited to happening only on the political right. Actually, the schism runs across our entire politics, and there are similar debates happening on the left as well, between the liberal and illiberals on the left. We're going to be sort of focusing on what's happening on the right now. That's what I focus on in my writing as well. But it isn't just conservatives and libertarians who are in disagreement or sort of actively disagreeing over this stuff. On the right, the folks who are on what I would describe as the wrong side of the liberalism schism, the other side of the schism, they tend to want you to believe that what distinguishes them from those of us on the other side is that they care a lot about the common good, and they're trying to achieve the common good. And if I leave you with nothing else today, I just want to very forcefully suggest that you not be duped by that suggestion. The vast majority of people care a lot about the common good. Now, I work for Reason Magazine. It's a secular libertarian magazine. Many of my colleagues are atheists, but when you ask them why are they libertarians, why do they believe so deeply in individual liberty, the answer that they will usually give you is something like, well, I believe that the norms and values of classical liberalism promote the conditions that lead to human flourishing. Now that language, they don't use the rhetoric of the common good when they give that answer, but that language could basically be ripped right out of the Catechism of the Catholic Church and its definition of what the common good is all about, promoting the conditions for human flourishing. So virtual is, in the end, trying to get to that same point, and the disagreement really is about what are the best means to that end. So the second piece of this that I want to leave you with is my alternative. If the thing that distinguishes these sort of illiberal conservatives or post-liberal conservatives, the folks on the other side of the schism, the thing that distinguishes them is not their concern with the common good. What is it? Well, I think the thing that makes them different from us is their sort of desire to acquire and wield the coercive power of the state to get to the place they want to be. Their belief is that individual liberty and the norms and values that support individual liberty and that sort of privilege individual liberty within especially our government haven't gotten us where we want to go. To try something else, and namely we need to try getting comfortable with wielding power. They would say conservatives for too long have believed that limited government is a conservative value and is the means to the end that we want to achieve. This hasn't worked and we want to try something else. And that means passing laws that enforce our ideas about the common good, that enforce our ideas about virtue on society. This is both in terms of economic policy and on social issues. Economically, they're generally speaking, I guess I would disagree a little bit with something that Andy said earlier. I think there is a sort of emergent policy agenda among these sort of post-liberal conservatives, and it tends to be economically sort of in favor of protectionism, tariffs, anti-immigration. It supports what they usually refer to as industrial policy, which is government subsidies to sort of prop up and support American industry and make sure that they don't lose in the competition against foreign companies and foreign industry, wage subsidies. On the social issues, it's also laws, not just values or institutions or cultural change, but actual coercive laws, often at the federal level, that would do things that would promote virtue, that would maybe make divorce harder to get, that would make pornography harder to access, that would require liquor stores to close on Sundays. And the most radical version of this also involves some sort of return to a true confessional state, essentially saying we ought to have that is itself a particular denomination of Christian. Again, the difference here is not the thing that they are going for in the end. The difference is the means to that end, and the means in their case is we want power. We want the coercive power of the state. We want to be comfortable. We want conservatives to be comfortable using the coercive power of the state to achieve the common good. That I think is a mistake. I think it is a rejection of the sort of fusionist legacy of the sort of American right. But I think the first sort of step to resisting that move is just sort of being clear-eyed about what's happening and what they're actually proposing. And so that's my attempt to sort of shine a light on what's going on and what the debate really is about.
Great. So let me just ask this, if I can try to channel our friends on the post-liberal right. They may say something along the following lines, and they may want to disagree with me, but it's something like this. Listen, liberalism would be fine if it actually did what it promised, if it allowed different communities to do different things, to live out their vision of the common good, that if it protected different religious communities. But what we have seen in practice, especially over the last century or half century, is that more and more progressive decisions from the courts, from the federal government, has slowly chipped away at religious freedom, the ability of states and localities to pass laws, to pass statutes, to pass different types of regulations, ordinances that allow communities to be different. So what liberalism has actually morphed into is kind of a progressive state that calls itself liberal. So I think what their response would be is, if this is just a game of power where progressives get control of the government, claim they're doing liberal things, but become illiberal by not allowing diversity, pluralism, self-determination. Well, we got to play the same game too, and we have to get power and exercise it. We can't unilaterally disarm. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think this is why it's so important to what I started with by saying that the schism runs across both the left and the right. There is this disagreement on the left. You have your illiberal progressives and you have your sort of old school liberals, like left liberals, who believe in individual liberty, free speech, religious liberty. They would sort of, this is the ACLU model of defending people even if we don't agree with them. But we'll defend the right of Nazis to march in Illinois. I would say that the thing that the post-liberals are reacting against and are up in arms about, what you just identified, is efforts on the post-liberal or the illiberal left that have rejected those values, who are trying to impose their illiberal progressivism on society. And so we need to just be clear about who we are against. We are against the illiberals on both sides, on the left or the right. Regardless, they're trying to reject these values and these sort of institutions that have grown up that promote individual liberty. There are opportunities. I mean, yes, I agree with you that the thing that the post-liberal right are saying is that, they're all about power. They don't care about these values that we care about. So why should we? We have to fight fire with fire. You hear this a lot. I just think that you don't defeat the enemy by becoming like them, first of all, and that there are opportunities now for those of us who are on what I would consider to be the correct schism, to work across the left-right aisle with those who are also on the correct side of the schism in defending the things that we as a country have often claimed to stand for, which is, again, individual liberty, limited government, rights for all, equal justice under the law, whether or not we actually agree with how you use your freedom.
I got to say that you just articulated way better than something that's been on my mind for quite some time, that maybe the problem isn't liberalism. It is that there have been illiberal forces that have caused a distortion in liberalism that is causing this the pendulum swing on the other side. So let's come back to that.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say that I would add as well that the liberal institutions that still exist around us in our society, the sort of liberalism in practice that Dan was talking about, have a good job actually of resisting these efforts by the illiberal left to tear down liberal norms and institutions. So every single time one of these cases goes to the Supreme Court where somebody is trying to force the Catholic nuns to pay for birth control, or whatever the sort of the controversy that the post-liberal right is up in arms about, I mean, almost always our institutions actually get it right in the end. I'm not saying that there isn't a messiness and a give and take and there aren't costs associated with having to battle it out. There are, but our institutions are liberal and they often do their job. And I think we can sometimes be so afraid because we feel like the things we believe in are under attack that we don't open our eyes and look around and see, like, okay, but actually are the institutions we built working the way we wanted them to? In many cases, they are.
That's great. James, let's get you in here. Thanks for joining us. What do you think?
Well, the piece that you invited me to talk about is less about the criticism of liberalism offered by post-liberal scholars and thinkers, and more about their own vision, to which Slade gave some references. And this is predominantly an idea of what's called Catholic integralism. And in my piece, I treat Catholic integralism as not as a cause, but as an effect. Traditionally in the United States, we've had robust institutions of local self-government, both formally in that we have townships that would require people to go vote on city ordinances or what have you, and informally in the form of civic associations that would be concerned with the public welfare, like the help of widows and orphans, or political associations like political parties that were traditionally decentralized, and so they could have a local agenda that might differ from a federal agenda. And these institutions were essential to preserving a Republican way of life across a very diverse set of peoples, of faiths, but also of regions, right? That have very different views, but like just geographical features. I live in the swamps down here in the South, and so it's very difficult to have a centralized administration that can both administer well to the swamps and to the deserts of Arizona. And so the decline of institutions of self-government, as well as increasing prioritization of leadership from people raised in like academic settings, tends to make people value intellectual gifts and top-down formats for government over the more traditional and more established and frankly freer forms of political institutions we've had in Republican self-government. And so it's no wonder that the more faithful Catholics that are raised in these institutions tend to prefer something like Catholic integralism. And Catholic integralism as a way of thought really begins as a response to the French Revolution, but by the early 20th century itself has become a revolutionary ideology in reaction to the liberal parliamentarism imposed on a lot of nations following the First World War. And Catholic integralists insist that nations should be confessional monarchies, and they are parties, the integralist parties in several states attempted to mount efforts to restore these monarchies, often as minority parties that couldn't quite succeed. And so collaborated with anti-liberal parties, which tended to be more aligned with Italian fascism. And so you had this epidemic of Catholic integralism collaborating with fascist parties during the 1930s, and they would raise up in regimes like Engelbert Dollfuss in Austria and Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War in Spain, often with alternatives being pretty bad too, like the communists of Spain weren't exactly the best people to Catholic priests. They, killed lots of them. And there's this sort of sense among post-liberals today that these are examples from which we can draw, and there's a lineage for this. Post-liberals often seem to be drinking very deeply from the well of Triumph magazine or the works of L. Brent Bozell, maybe Marshner from Triumph magazine, and looking back to these figures as counterexamples. We've seen people recommend a return to corporatism or a form of state capitalism, often by drawing associations both to early forms of Catholic social thought, the success of corporatism, it wasn't really all that successful, but in some European states during the 1930s, and then also with allusions to China. And my view is that all of this kind of appeal is a response to a real decline in the capacity for people to engage in self-government, as well as the prestige in self-government. It's not something that prestigious people do. Instead, this sort of intellectual top-down mentality is at work. And it's no substitute for actual practice of politics at the local level. And ironically, what you end up with in terms of a revolutionary ideology of Catholic integralism is something that is the mirror image of the revolutionary ideology of the French Revolution. Neither has any sense of how to govern. They just believe that if you have the right ideas, then good laws will naturally be the product.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. We're getting a bunch of questions in, and I want to encourage people to keep sending them. I'm going to start to get them in. I want to come back to this question of self-government public participation in a moment, but there's a preceding question to that, which is if anyone has ever gone and tried to look up the definition of liberalism, you'll probably find 5 or 10 different versions of it. All of the things it could include and used to include or might include. So let me ask each of you, do you have a go-to, not even definition, but if you're thinking about how to go about governing, we are a think tank here and we need to think about policy eventually, to think about governing, what are the long poles in the tent of liberalism that ought to guide our thinking? What are the things that, Dan, in your language, if it's about practice, not just theory, what are the parts of liberalism that we need to hold on to, particularly if they're under assault from either the left or the right? Is it democracy? Is it freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association? What is that list, each of you? Dan, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Okay. Big question. I think, but I would fasten on to what James spent a lot of his opening remarks on. I mean, I think the reason that the thing worth defending is worth calling liberalism is that it's free government as opposed to despotic government. It's just this basic distinction that we can see all over the world. It's obviously something of a sliding scale and a spectrum, but free government means where people are governed primarily by law rather than by the whims of their rulers, and where they participate in that governance themselves to the extent possible. And that means in a large country under modern conditions, with modern communication and so on, that's going to mean preference for local government over national government, because very few of us have any capacity to affect national government, but people can be involved in their own local government. It's going to mean a preference for fostering the kind of voluntary associations, Andy, that you referred to earlier, because again, that's something where people actually have a say, and the more decisions get made by government, period, and especially by state or national government, the less people have a say in the running of their own lives. And so I think that people's ability to run their own lives, both individually and collectively, and the collectively point is important because to simply rely on anti-government rhetoric, as if we were to sound like government was always the problem, would leave out the fact that government is unavoidably extremely involved in all of our lives, and somebody's going to be holding those levers of power. So there's no way to avoid. There's no way to avoid government making decisions that will deeply affect our lives. What we should want is that those decisions should be made as much as possible by the people involved in them, by the people most affected by them, and that's why again it's not anti-government, but preference for lower levels of government that I think is particularly important here.
So I think that's great, and I'd love to see how Slade responds to this, because that was just sort of like an articulation of like how I've been thinking about subsidiarity, that like I'm not anti-government, but I want to make sure that we have a rule of thumb or rules of thumb about what are the areas that local governments ought to be involved in, or state governments or the federal government ought to be involved in. And I'm much more open to the idea of liberalism being receptive to the police powers of states and localities to decide what's the old-time term, the health and morals of a community. Slade, as our resident libertarian here, I think you might balk at that think that there should be more limits on those kinds of things. So you can either respond to the broader question of what are the big poles in the tent of liberalism that you want to make sure that we defend, or this question of like who can govern and in what areas, or what should those limits be?
I think I would push back a little bit against the idea that liberalism is merely procedural. It is. I mean, certainly having fair processes in place that take into account, that allow for self-government isn't important. But when I think of what does it mean, what is classical liberalism, I think that it is sort of valuing individual liberty from aggression, coercion, fraud. And so there is a substantive component here as well. If 50% plus one of the population wants to infringe the rights of the other 49%, that is democratic. That is sort of that is democratic, but it is not liberal, I think, because liberalism assumes a certain amount of the sort of broad individual liberty of everybody in the society, and so government, you're right. You guys are right that government always sort of exercises coercion. I mean, by definition, the sort of definition of government is that it is the entity that legitimately exercises violence in society. That is why we want to limit it, because we want people to be free to make their choices for themselves. And it is very, very important, the sort of corollary to that, to add that part of that freedom can and should involve coming together in various ways to solve problems. There is an illiberal, again, there's an illiberalism, especially on the left, that says that if I as a young Catholic woman wants to follow the sort of teachings about sexual morality that the church teaches, that is an illiberal choice on my part, or that is a sort of that's a thing that they should have some say over whether I can do that, and that sort of broadly construed, that idea that somebody else can tell me that I cannot make voluntary choices that in practice constrain how I live or who I associate with. That is, I think, is very important to sort of correctly define that or categorize that as illiberalism, not liberalism. So yeah, I think this point about process versus substantive freedom is important especially, and it comes out a lot when we're talking about economic policy, because again, like it's very easy to be like, well, it's in the interest of the common good if every business has to pay $25 an hour minimum wage. You can make that argument, I guess. I mean, then we're making an empirical case, but it is still an infringement on the sort of individual sort of rights of association and right of private property of the business owner, and by the way, the worker, to form a contract according to whatever terms they believe are in their own best interest, and not have somebody far away telling them what is in their best interest.
Great. James, thoughts about this?
The two big parts of liberalism that are probably most important, at least for me, are the formal establishment of a separation of church and state, in which conscience becomes a question of both the individual person as well as the associations of the various churches to proselytize the beliefs of the broader public. The imposition of a confessional state has always been both bad for the state and for the church it seeks to support. Which is sometimes very difficult for people to accept. They want to believe that if the church and the state are together, then somehow they'll become more powerful because they're both powerful institutions. But when the church becomes a party to the state, it often just becomes a vassal. And so people who are part of that church are understood to be supporting the regime, and then opponents of the regime therefore oppose both the regime and the church. And this is part of the issue that led to the French Revolution itself. The second part of liberalism that's important is the insistence on the protection of minority rights, which isn't necessarily like a part of all forms of liberalism. And we've been using a term that's very broad. And it's important to note that in the aforementioned text that Dan Burns brought up, Why Liberalism Failed, Patrick Deneen goes to great lengths to try to demonstrate that Anglo-American liberalism and continental liberalism, which are typically taught as very distinct traditions, are actually the same. When Anglo-American liberalism has had a much stronger emphasis on the protection of minority rights, actually stemming from this issue of church establishment, wherein eventually dissenting Protestants achieved a certain degree of toleration under an official Anglican confession, eventually even leading to the toleration and eventual religious liberty of Catholics. Although presently under the UK, it's not in the best shape it's ever been. In the United States, it's still pretty good. That we would have this protection of minority rights is a very fundamental component of the establishment of American liberalism, in my view. But it's tied to the first in an essential way.
Great. All right. A question that is coming up that's been on my mind is this link between liberalism and democracy. And I've always thought of them in the American context as being mutually reinforcing. But increasingly, there's this question in the discussion of liberalism is what is also the role of democracy in it. So you could see an illiberal but highly majoritarian country. And I think we're starting to see the outlines of this in some European nations, where they kind of dispense with a bunch of these freedoms, but allow kind of a populist, nationalist, majoritarian way to rule. So this would be democracy or majoritarianism absent liberalism. Or you could just dispense with both and just say, the people get it wrong and we don't need these liberties. We either need kind of technocratic progressives on the left or more like natural law, integralist folks on the right to tell us what the common good is or what the good life is, and just use force to bring that about. So do any of you have thoughts, like especially emerging what we're seeing in other countries in here, about the role of democracy, or as we would call it, republicanism, and its relationship to liberalism? Anyone can take that.
So I'll start because you said republicanism. So that's me. The United States is a republic, which as a regime type means that it actually precedes the importance of its liberalism. Traces of its liberalism are found in examples of the language in the Declaration of Independence, much less so, say, in the Constitution, as Dan shows in his piece. The problem of democracy is that outside the United States, is that a lot of the states we're talking about, places like Poland and Hungary, have very large ethnic majorities that associate their ethnic population with the nation. And so Hungarians will understand the Hungarian state to be for Hungarians, and Poles and the Polish state will understand it to be for the Poles. And so there is this sort of ethnic appeal that you can make in those countries that is a little more seamless in order to achieve a pretty sizable majority, or at least that's the hope among post-liberals. In the United States, the attempt to achieve an ethnic majority is actually very difficult because it requires cobbling together very different groups of people into a single coherent ethnic category, which is often very difficult to do. I like to teach my students about, very early in the 20th century, Jews were not white. This was something that changed over time and changes in a very critical way during the mid-century for reasons that are very relevant to this conversation. So the efforts to create these kinds of ethnic majorities are also occurring on the left in the form of identity politics, but they're always composites, and they don't have quite the same success as states where you have large ethnic majorities, like in Hungary and Poland.
Yeah, I would just weigh in on this by pushing back on something or raising a question that I'd like to hear Stephanie Slade answer, because she's mentioned a couple of times. You can see it all over in the kind of educated center-left discussion, on the New York Times opinion page and elsewhere, including most recently from the Pope on that same page, but from many other people as well, over the past 5 years, in this distinction between populism and democracy. And roughly, the word populism gets used by these folks to mean a kind of democracy that leads to outcomes that they think are bad. And democracy gets used to mean the kind of democracy that leads to outcomes that they think are good. My difficulty with Stephanie's optimism about this sort of coalition of the right-minded liberals on both sides of the political aisle is that this contempt for what they call populism, or for various other things that they associate with majoritarian populist movements, whether it's in the U.S. or abroad, is a contempt for an awful lot of things that I think all of us believe are worth defending. And I'll just give an example. And we haven't yet talked about the fact that this conversation, both on these panelists and among the critics of liberalism, is to a large extent driven by Catholics. And maybe I don't know whether we want to talk about that to what extent, but Catholics in the United States tend to run more institutions than Protestants do. And so Catholics, among other things, tend to be more sensitive when the government threatens those institutions. And in this Congress, the House of Representatives, including, I believe, every single Democratic member, maybe there were one or two dissenters, I don't think so, passed something called the Equality Act, which includes which would be the first act to include an explicit carve out from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. In other words, it explicitly says federal religious freedom provisions will not apply to this act. And it would destroy institutions like Catholic institutions like the one that I teach at, imposing a certain understanding of non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, which is impossible to run the type of Catholic school that we are on the basis of this version of non-discrimination. Maybe Georgetown can do it, but UD would not. And this has already passed the House. I'm sure that these consistent, well, whether it's consistent or not, these sort of right-thinking, old-fashioned liberals exist at Reason Magazine, at a number of other institutions. I have some of them colleagues of mine at UD, but where are they politically, Stephanie? It seems that politically the Democratic Party is in a very different place, and that is part of why conservatives are so frightened of this movement and are looking to fight it by whatever means they can find.
Okay, a few things. Let me start by saying I think it's most understandable that sort of allure of power, of wielding state power to get where we want to go, is most sort of understandable when you believe that you are part of a silenced majority, when you believe that you are on the side of the majority and some minority has somehow gotten the power and is trying to overrule your rights, right? And so to the extent that that's true in any particular scenario, then yeah, that's a problem, actually. I mean, that is an illiberal by definition. That is a problem, and we should be concerned anytime that actually manages to get all the way to the point of coercion being exercised by a minority against a majority. What is interesting, though, about, and kind of hilarious about the fact that this I guess we're the counter-reformation, so this response to the illiberalism on the left the form that it has taken in many cases is this sort of Catholic integralism, is that Catholics are what, 23% of this country? We are the minority. It's sort of funny. It's a funny, coincidence, I guess, here that we happen to all come from Catholic backgrounds on this panel. We can't lose sight of the fact that we are not actually representing, that the folks who want a Catholic confessional state or a Catholic monarch are not representing. They're not just not Republican. They're also illiberal in that sense of dispensing with both, both minority rights and majority rights. And in that case, if they actually got their way. Again, I would come back to the importance of looking at the actual outcomes produced by the institutions that we have. And although I am also very concerned about the Equality Act and many other sort of threats on the horizon, and I wrote a long piece for America magazine a couple of years ago where I said, like, we should not just assume that the First Amendment will protect us, people of faith, from the sort of rampaging illiberal left, because if they win the hearts and minds of the American public, the law will change. The courts will not be a bulwark forever. But winning the hearts and minds of the American public is the key. I mean, having the people on your side, the court system, for better or worse. I mean, the judges may claim to be insulated from the sort of zeitgeist of the population. I think most sort of cynical or realists out there understand better. I mean, the point is you have to sort of have the public on your side. You have to, first and foremost, you have to sort of have the hearts and minds or the public opinion or the culture with you. The institutions have done a pretty good job of preventing the minority rule. We'll see what happens with this particular bill that Dan is mentioning. It's not law yet. We've seen a lot of backlash against attempts like this. I believe, this is just my opinion, but I'm a political journalist, so I'll give it anyway. I believe that the Donald Trump presidency was a backlash against overreaches of exactly that kind by the Obama administration. So I think there are mechanisms within our liberal institutions that correct for and prevent the worst of these abuses from actually ever coming to pass. They're threats, and we have to be worried about them, but we're not actually living in the sort of dystopian nightmare of these post-liberals.
I just like to jump in 1 second, if you don't mind. This is not new. This attack on Catholic institutions. This is an old story. It's been around a long time. There were the Bible riots in, I want to say, Philadelphia. There was the burning of the convent in Charleston. I think that was in 1834. There were the Blaine amendments. This stuff's been around a long time. Catholics have been a minority in this country and have seen Protestant or sectarian liberal majorities accost Catholic civil liberties in the past. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see it occur again, nor should we expect Catholics to be the only target. Instead, what this means is, I think as Slade says correctly, there needs to be a winning of hearts and minds. And in this respect, we've actually seen a pretty significant failure of Catholic institutions to do that. There's this kind of loss prevention mentality and among many dioceses where they just keep their heads down and hope that they can secretly apply their sort of persuasive techniques to the relevant people. But at a certain point, there needs to be a march in the streets. And we're seeing people like, is it Bishop or Archbishop Cordileone? I forget what his title is, but out in San Francisco, who's been marching on religious liberty issues. So it takes a certain amount of institutional leadership, and there's only so much we corduroy-wearing academics can do on that.
Okay, we have about 12 minutes left, and there are two questions I want to ask, and you can choose if you respond, which of these you respond to, and I think they're linked, but I'm going to leave it up to you. So the first is, it appears, at least over the past couple years, that although many people thought the courts were hostile to religious freedom, that like the free exercise clause seems to be revitalized. There's the Masterpiece Cake decision, there's Espinoza, there's the most recent decision within the past week or so, where the new conservative majority protected the Catholic churches and synagogues in New York. So it seems like there is increased sense among the courts recently that religious liberty is an essential part of, I guess, refounding, revitalizing the sense of liberalism. So if any of you want to respond to like the new court, the way courts are involved in now protecting religious liberty in a way that they probably hadn't, say a decade ago, when the first part of the religion clause, the no establishment clause, seemed to be the dominant one. So you can respond to that. Or the question that we got that is haunting me from the chat comes from a student, and I'm particularly interested in what the professors have to say about it. Essentially, the question boils down to, like, the concept of liberalism used to defend young people, students who wanted to share different ideas on campus. But now if you have a different point of view, you can quickly be labeled all sorts of things. You can be silenced. You can be sent to different types of training programs. And I, at least anecdotally, have noticed that some of the people on the right who were most animated by post-liberal thought seem to be younger, like just out of college, folks on the right of center. So I'm wondering if there's some connection here, what we've seen on college campuses being illiberalism from the left, and the response among some of these younger students is saying, liberalism hasn't protected me. I can't think, I can't talk. Well, if this is all about power, well, I'm going to be an illiberal on the right. So if anyone wants to talk about either the courts or this campus illiberalism producing a different type of illiberalism, have at it.
Well, I wouldn't be a research fellow at First Liberty Institute. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't also mention the Bladensburg Cross decision, which they helped actually get a decision on. In many cases,
do you want to explain that?
People, what's that?
Do you want to explain that decision?
Oh, sure. There was a cross that was on a previous, I think it was a privately maintained graveyard that had a very large cross that was supposed to indicate that this was the burial place of people who died in the First World War, veterans of the First World War. I forget if it was both or. And eventually the graveyard was turned over to the state of Maryland. And when it became public property, the American Humanist Association sued, saying that this was an Establishment Clause violation because it was an excessive entanglement of the state of Maryland with the Christian faith because of its public profession of the Christian faith by establishing a very large cross. And if you've ever seen the Bladensburg Cross, it's big. It's hard to miss. And the courts ruled against the American Humanist Association, saying that this is a longstanding monument with an enduring sort of legacy, and so it's not the establishment of a faith. It's sort of like a passive statement. And that it was not a decisive obliteration of the previous decision of Lemon v. Kurtzman, which is sort of the holding doctrine behind the really, really sharp separation of church and state. But you could treat that as kind of the first crack in the wall of separation that allows for a freer form of jurisprudence for people to engage in religious activity in public settings. So there has been a trend in this direction. Part of this is linked to the establishment of new institutions. There's been the Beckett law firm. First Liberty's been around since the 90s. It's just been very difficult to find the right cases and to get the cases through the process. This is a time-intensive kind of work, and it's only just now bearing fruit after about 10 years of cultivating the garden, if you'll allow that metaphor. But it's also been about who's been getting on the courts. These are, under the Trump administration, there have been much more friendly to religious liberty judges getting appointed, and probably the friendliest to religious liberty cases are actually on the Supreme Court, people like Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett. So these are very significant. These are very significant additions to the court, and will probably be seeing a lot more of the Diocese of Brooklyn v. Cuomo decisions. Although Gorsuch kind of channeled his inner Scalia, went after some people in that decision. It was kind of a spicy decision. As to the student, at a previous institution where I worked, there was a conservative student who was attempting to be provocative by trying to bring in what were then considered interesting or kind of like FUs to the student body, like Milo Yiannopoulos, onto campus, with the idea being that this was going to be kind of planting their conservative flag. And there's been this kind of ratcheting up of limitations on student speech where conservatives try to buck the administrative regime by inviting increasingly controversial figures. And I remember pleading with the student to stop because the right approach would be to bring in interesting, provocative, but also grounded figures who might be able to subtly challenge the presuppositions both administrators and their fellow students have about the way conservatives think about the country. And I was not listened to, and I was very sad. And part of what you're seeing in terms of the hostility to conservative students on campus has to do with what people who graduated 4 years ago did, and this kind of alt-right moment we had. And if it's that bad, it's time to stop going to places like this. If you're going to go to college, you should probably be going to institutions that are actually going to listen to you and take you seriously. And these institutions are often harder to find, but are very capable in providing you education without making you feel like you're under the regime of a thought police. Dan teaches at one, I teach at one. So plugs to UD or University of Dallas, I'll say the name, and Ave Maria University.
Yeah, I strongly support that shout out. I also appreciate the subtle shout out for the four of us getting invited to speak on campus. That was very good too, James. No, I think the two questions are related, and I'll tell this story about the Bladensburg Cross case. I saw a panel on it, a nice balanced 2 liberals, 2 conservatives panel on this case shortly before it was handed down in DC, at which somebody who had argued that case at one of the lower court levels told the story of being asked by one of the judges on the panel she was arguing before whether the problem could be solved. And we're talking about it's maybe a 40, 50 foot cross. It's a serious cross, yeah, out of brick or stone. And she asked, right in the middle of a rotary, so everyone can see it as they drive by. And she says the judge asked whether they could solve the problem by just lopping off the arms of the cross so that it would just be a pillar. And the 2 liberals on this panel were waiting for the punchline. You could see it in their body language. They were waiting to hear what the point of the story was. And then the 2 conservatives on the panel thought that this was the punchline, of course. This was obviously a ludicrous suggestion and shows how messed up this judge is. So that kind of intellectual and moral divide is what I was trying to push Stephanie to talk more about a second ago, and what I think what we're seeing, especially young, but lots of conservatives react to. The fact that most of our institutions of higher learning are run by people on the one side of that divide who just don't see why you can't just lop off the arms of the Bladensburg Cross. It turns out that these nice principles, which I support in principle as many other people do, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, open discourse, and so on, it turns out that those in practice always get applied within a certain cultural context under certain moral presuppositions. And if your moral presuppositions are that my moral beliefs and the moral beliefs of millions of Americans like me are so beyond the pale that they're not even worth entertaining seriously, then it gets harder to make the case why a speaker should be allowed to express those beliefs on campus, why a student should be allowed to have a bumper sticker on their door expressing those beliefs, whatever else. And so I think the problem that's driving this questioning of liberal theory is the awareness, I think, the increasing awareness that the same words, these words about liberalism and freedom and so on, can be used by different people with different moral presuppositions to mean very different things, and that we all end up applying them unavoidably in light of those moral presuppositions. And there's still plenty of room for common ground and all that, but that if we pretend that the words somehow have a sufficiently robust, independent meaning to get us through these really contentious debates, especially over issues related to family and sexuality, then we're going to be asking these kinds of principles to do more work than they can actually do in the real world.
All right, we are just about out of time, so I want to give everyone a minute or so just to say a final word, just along the lines of, if we believe that the increase in post-liberal or illiberal thought, whether on the left or especially on the right, is a response to a set of conditions, how do we try to take away, or how do we take away the energy of this the illiberal reaction? What are the things that we can do to make people feel like illiberalism isn't the answer? And what I've been pushing on for quite some time now is that it feels to me that in a continental democratic republic that is as diverse as ours, we need governing leaders who are willing to show a great deal of humility and not use the government power that they might have to do everything that they want. And that means courts respecting pluralism. It means the federal government respecting federalism and localism. It means governments respecting a diverse civil society. And to actually have liberalism, that means allowing people to do a bunch of stuff that you don't like. And when we have a homogenizing state, especially at the federal government, who forces everyone to live in a certain way under the guise of liberalism, but what it really is one way of life, then I think that ends up fostering illiberal thoughts. So I keep encouraging people to do public service, but at the same time, realize that public service doesn't mean getting power and making everybody live the way that you want to. In a continental democratic pluralistic republic, sometimes the best use of power is not using that power to force people to do the things that you want. Feel free to disagree with that or just say your own piece. Maybe Stephanie, do you want to go first?
Sure. I always hate the part where we get in these conversations where we get to the point where it's like, okay, so what is your solution to solve all the problems facing our country? The answer, and I actually I'm going to have a big long piece coming out in Reason in about a couple of months, probably because print timelines are very long. But I finished writing it over the weekend, where I said, like, ultimately at the end of the day, I don't have an answer to all these problems. I don't, but I know for sure is that the state is not a shortcut or a substitute for the hard work of changing culture and building institutions. That you cannot, impose a virtuous society from the top down. You have to build it from the ground up. That is all I know for sure. And it's not easy. And I don't know the right way to go about doing that because I'm a journalist. But there are a lot of people out there that probably have better ideas. I know Andy has a lot, and I'm very excited to see what will come of them. But it has to happen from the ground up, and it has to happen through, voluntarily and at the community level and through experimentation to see what works. Because the only thing worse than a bad solution is a bad solution that somebody forces upon everybody, from Washington.
Thank you, Slade. James, do you want to go next?
Sure. I've been taking this from a more religious perspective, and I think I'm just going to go with that. There needs to be considerably more religious leadership in this country, and it's been very disappointing to see bishops, Catholic bishops, sort of hiding in their diocesan offices and not taking the lead to take accountability on issues of the sex abuse scandal or the McCarrick cover-ups. And maybe sell the rectories, wear sackcloth and ashes. And I'm not kidding. Like, this is the kind of stuff that penitential people should be doing. And I think that this would be a rather significant sign to believers of all kinds that religious authorities mean what they say. We've certainly seen some kind of life coming out of some of these bishops. But in the process of the bishops doing this, they need to avoid doing too much partisan politics. Because the trouble that we see with religious leaders of any denomination is that when they become too tied up with party leadership, people tend to regard them as just attachés of a party agenda. And so if we could have authentic expressions of religious belief among the various denominations in this country, it would be much easier for people to take them seriously and not take seriously claims of bad motives or bad faith that often opponents to religious liberty will lob. And in the process, if the sort of nightmare scenario of the full disenfranchisement of religious institutions, like Daniel Burns was talking about a second ago, then there needs to be a public demonstration in the streets about these sorts of things. There needs to be a return to the full demonstration of a political resistance to the seizure of Republican liberty. It will not stand. Thank you.
Dan, you get the final word.
Well, without taking away anything that was just said, I would say three basic solutions. If you are young or know young people, encourage them to go to educational institutions that will actually teach them how to think, and which is the only way of bridging the kind of divide that we've been talking about here, I think. If you're talking about people who graduated already from their education, they need to read Yuval Levin's most recent book. Find themselves institutions that they can be part of, preferably lifelong, that are actually institutions that actually allow them and others to live the kind of human lives that they want to live, and they should be passionate about defending those institutions, including in court where necessary. And then when it comes to national politics, since we can't avoid having national politics, shift the Republican Party towards the interests of the working class. But that's a whole other conversation.
Well, we can pick that up next time.
Yeah.
So thank you to James, to Dan, to Slade, and for all of the MI folks behind the scenes who enabled this to happen. Happy holidays to all of you. I appreciate your time, and for those watching, hope to see all of you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy.